Nothing like heading out for a nice day on the water only to find yourself on the hard, just like some of the people we'll see in this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. Our first story to make the boating news this week is going to follow right along this line, as it's going to take us over to the Turkish coastline and take us a few weeks back, where this was the scene when a 12-meter luxury sailing yacht wound up losing propulsion from one of its engines during a storm and found itself on the rocks near the coast of Mersin. The vessel is a 12-meter sailing yacht that is flagged from the United States called the Lotus, and the couple had brought the vessel over from the United States to Europe. They were trying to make it into port to get away from the storm when all of a sudden they lost propulsion in their engine and the wind and waves wound up pushing their boat up onto the rocks. Once the couple realized they were in a dire situation, they quickly got to work deploying the dinghy to the vessel. Fortunately, both were able to get off the boat without any injury. Unfortunately though, the boat didn't have the same luck. As we can see in these images here, the vessel is absolutely being battered against the rocky Turkish coastline and winds up suffering some heavy hull damage to the vessel during the incident. Unfortunately, due to the rough sea state at the time of the incident, local authorities were unable to get the vessel off the rocks at this time and had to come back a little bit later once the conditions calmed down. Here in these images though, you can see as they went to recover the boat just how bad the hull damage wound up being to the Lotus. Surprisingly, in this situation, they wind up enlisting some local fishermen to help get the boat off the rocks, who actually do wind up getting this vessel somehow successfully off the rocks and successfully brought back into port, which is quite the surprise with the amount of damage the boat has here. Once it was brought into port, they actually were able to successfully get the boat off the water by lifting it out with a crane, but I do have to imagine this vessel is going to be a total loss in the end. Now, this crew wasn't the only crew out there on the water over the last couple weeks that had to deal with some poor weather, as our next story to make the boating news is going to keep us over in Europe, but bring us over to the United Kingdom, where this was the scene just a couple weeks back, as several cruise ships wound up encountering some horrible weather, including this vessel, Saga Cruise Line's Spirit of Discovery. The vessel wound up encountering some horrible sea conditions in the United Kingdom's Bay of Biscay. The conditions were so rough that the vessel's automatic safety system wound up becoming activated, actually causing the boat to list heavy to one side before it came to a stop. The vessel was embarked on a 14-day cruise to the Canary Islands with about 1,000 people on board the vessel. Unfortunately, the conditions were so bad the cruise line actually had to turn around and go back to the UK and wound up docking in Portsmouth. Once they got back to port and began to assess the situation, members of the cruise wound up coming out and saying that approximately 100 people suffered minor injuries, to show you just how rough it was out on the water for this cruise liner. Apparently, the captain even came over the loudspeaker at one point, telling all passengers to either remain lying down or seated at all times for their safety due to the extreme rough conditions. Most people who were interviewed after the event claimed that the worst part of the incident was when the ship's safety systems wound up activating. It caused the vessel to veer to the left sharply and then all of a sudden come to a complete halt. Now, I've seen multiple reports on how long the vessel was halted, but I've seen reports of upwards of 12 hours that the vessel sat idle before it began to move again. Currently, the British government's gone ahead and launched an investigation into this incident to try and determine exactly what happened during this cruise. Our next story to make the boating news this week is going to take us up to the Pacific Northwest, where several weeks ago, two men went out on a fishing trip off the coast of Washington and wound up missing. The Coast Guard launched a search for the men, but back on October 25th wound up suspending that search. Almost a week later, a group of fishermen was off fishing off the coast of Washington when all of a sudden they spotted a life raft, and on board was one of the men who had been adrift for nearly 13 days. The man survived aboard a life raft out in the middle of the Pacific Northwest during these 13 days, which is pretty impressive considering the frigid conditions he was facing. The man survived on fish as he found fishing line in the bottom of the life raft and was able to catch a single salmon. The crew that discovered the man brought him on board quickly, got him some warm clothes and a warm meal, and contacted the Coast Guard to let them know of their discovery. The Coast Guard quickly met up with the fishing vessel and wound up pulling the man on board to bring him back to dry land. The Coast Guard claims the man was brought back to dry land and actually in really good health, especially for being stranded at sea for 13 days. Thanks for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of Boating News of the Week. If you ever see anything crazy happening on your waterways, be sure to hit us up on Facebook or Instagram and let us know, and you might see your stories over here, just like RV Guy Planes, Jennifer James Stansel, and James Simon did this week. And if you guys haven't already, go ahead and drop an anchor on the subscribe button here.